I always thought, I thought that's really lovely. Hard questions with a smile. I always got to remember that. And I was just, I clearly have deep curiosity on how organizations work. Like, I could feel it by the nature and the depth of the questions, right? And I'm just wondering, like, where did that come from for you? Like,
Oh
how'd you
boy.
get interested in, like, or how orgs work and how
Well,
come you go pursue that?
well, I mean, it's hard to figure out one cause. I gave you an answer sort of off air, but I realized since that maybe more than anything else, my late father was a defense subcontractor, and he was always for the U.S. Navy. He was always so frustrated by the Navy bureaucracy and why it couldn't be better. I mean, in my whole youth, and I worked for him some too. Thank goodness, not too long. That would not have worked out. But he would just come home and he would just complain about every day about how things were just so difficult to do. And then I became an organizational psychologist, and I got my PhD at Michigan, and my mentor is a guy named in organizational psychology, University of Michigan. And one thing that really did make me curious, and I think hopefully runs through my work, is Bob Kahn, who just died a couple of years ago at the age of 100, just like a masterful person. Yeah, Bob Kahn basically taught me that the reason for an organization is to kind of do two things. One is to be effective, whatever their mission is. It could be making cars, it could be not fixing government like you folks, but at the same time being a place that is humane for the people who work there and takes care of them. So that two-pronged thing was always there. And in fact, my dissertation was on organizational death in Michigan in the early 80s. Not what caused it, but the process of how you closed it down. So it was everything from the geography department at Michigan to plants in Flint. I spent a lot of time in Flint, Michigan,
Yeah,
and where I learned that it was not a good idea to go there in my Japanese car, for example.
right.
Things like that. But to me, I guess it would be my father, and then it would be Bob Kahn, he was just such a wonderful role model and mentor.
And after you left U of M, you went out to Stanford and you started on a journey that had you really just digging into organizations. It's always been a deep interest of mine. And you wrote these books like No Asshole Rule, right?
Right. Yes.
Good Boss, Bad Boss on it. And, at Civilla, one of our like core, beliefs is we want to get friction out of these public serving institutions and get humanity in, and to do it in a way that allows the organizations to go get after the purpose for which they were really chartered. And I'm just wondering, like, in that journey from writing books, starting 20 some years ago now, how'd you end up really zeroing in on friction?
Well, there's sort of two answers. One is a classic Silicon Valley answer. The other one's more personal. So my colleague, here it is, Huggy Rao and I, 10 years ago, we wrote Scaling Up Excellence, which is basically focused on how you grow organizations and how you spread good things throughout organizations, including a lot of design thinking, actually. And in the process, there were all these organizations that we would work with that their goal was to scale, baby, scale. That's like Silicon Valley speak. And then they'd have this giant organization, and it would be, oh my God, what have I created? It's this frustrating, crazy things. So we're involved in Facebook, Google, pretty early days, and now there are these really bureaucratic things. So that was that problem that got us interested, just because the people we worked with would talk about it. And then more personally, since I've been at Stanford more than 40 years, Stanford has not grown that much in terms of the number of students or tenure track faculty. I'm thinking maybe 20 or 25% in the years that I've been here. But we have so many administrators. We have so many rules. It's so hard to get things done. And so that's the other That's the other part, is that just the personal experience of having an organization that got larger, older, and more complex, that things just got harder and harder to get done. So the book starts out with a 1,266 word email with a 7,500 word attachment, inviting all 2,000 Stanford faculty members to do a brainstorm on Zoom. I still don't know how you do a brainstorm with 2,000 people, but that's an example of something that I think was not a good use of our time. So personal, and I guess, more like intellectual or whatever. So that's how we got interested in it.
And
Mike,
as you got going on it, in the friction, you identified, like, not all friction's bad. There's
No.
friction and there's bad friction. And we have a lot of leaders who have joined us today, and we'll watch this at a different time, that, are really struggle with friction inside of their organization and can get generally thought of as, it's, what I'm facing in friction is bad. But maybe just give us some context how you think about bad friction versus good friction.
Well, for us, it's going to be different for every organization, but for us, there's certain sort of diagnostic questions. One diagnostic question that we think of is just along the lines of, well, is it, let's take decisions, is it a reversible decision or not? If it's a decision that's easily reversible, then you should do it really quickly. That's like the prototyping world. We haven't talked about Civilla enough. I think we should talk about it more. But didn't you do something like 6 or 7 different prototypes of the form that that?
I mean, the application, just for everyone on the line, we took the longest application in the US for public benefits. And through working with residents and frontline workers, determined that it could be 80% shorter and move through the system in half the time. But it wasn't going from 0 to 60 just overnight. It was a long process of iterating with the end user, the residents, and getting feedback and learning that a turn of phrase or a word can make things, so much better. But it's in that iteration that we ultimately got something that could be launched statewide.
And I also love that example, and it's wonderful to be interviewed by you. I don't think I've done an interview where I haven't mentioned the form in Civilla. And just for people, viewers in the audience, my favorite question to show you how difficult it was when was your child conceived? Which is that, because if I just say that to any audience, everybody immediately gets, oh, there's too much there. So in that story, I think, to me, that shows the difference between good and bad friction, that you were doing something creative, you were doing something complex. And so you slowed down to do it right. And also you had all these constituencies to deal with.
Right.
So to me, that's just a great example that sometimes you have to slow down so you can go faster later. In this case, so how many people complete that form every year? It's millions, right?
Oh, it's 2.5 million residents on an annual basis, either online or in paper. It was taking them, north of an hour to do it. Now it can be done in, under 15 minutes.
Oh,
that's great. Done. But I think in this good friction, bad friction, frame, and one of the things that we learned was getting it to 80% shorter and moving through the system in half the time. That definitely got bad friction out. Right? But what we learned is that alone isn't enough, because the inertia inside of all institutions, this isn't just to this particular state, in all institutions, will steamroll right back in.
Yep.
So we actually had to work with state leadership, and none of this would have been possible without stellar state leadership at the state of Michigan, all the way through 2 administrations and that. But to set governance on it, where it wasn't so easy for the good that had been put in for it to roll back. And so in essence, putting in some good friction to make it not so easy just to lob on a new question, a new question, a new question, and then quickly, it would have been back to 42 pages. And we were working to make sure that it had a more durable nature to it, and found that get bad friction out, but there are times to strategically place good friction.
Well, so I love that example. And so one of my heroes, the book, this is Subtract by Leidy Klotz, great book for folks who are interested. Leidy and his colleagues did a bunch of research that shows that we human beings, our natural tendency when we solve a problem is just to add more and more complexity, unless we're forced to think about it or it's impossible to do. And getting people to stop adding, let alone subtract, it's just not a natural thing. So I love the idea of putting up friction to get in the way. One of the examples, which I think, at least at Stanford, I can relate to this, and I suspect many folks in the audience can too, is how in many organizations, everybody seems to have the power to add a different app. And I have this, like to make an appointment, to have a video call. I'm always having to learn like a new app. So what that does is it causes all sorts of problems with switching, and unnecessary learning, and it also causes problems with coordination between different parts of an organization, because people give up working together because they don't understand each other's software. So one of the CTOs that actually my friend Paul Leonardi worked with, we wrote a little piece for Harvard Business Review. So what the CTO did was he got tired of people adding more and more software. So this is good friction and also top down. I hate to be too authoritarian, but he made it so that anytime you wanted to renew your subscription to a software or to add new software, he had to give written approval. And within a year, they cut the technology stack from about 55 to about 26 or 27 bits of software. And one thing they did discover, kind of a medium-sized company, was that, for example, they were paying for 4 versions of Slack and only had to pay for 1. So there was a financial benefit too. But to me, that's an example of using good friction to avoid bad friction, which is exactly what you did with the state of Michigan with governance too. To make it hard for everybody, because we humans, we just want to add stuff. It's just how our brains work.
Yeah, for sure. Elena, I know we've gotten some questions in.
Yeah,
Maybe.
I want to actually jump in and ask one for Chris. Thank you for asking this question. He's asking, in the application form example, how do you communicate the importance of simplicity, decentralizing, adding complexity while maintaining stakeholder alignment?
Yeah, we have a saying at Civilla, you want folks in on it and up on it so they're not down on it. And I would say one of the key things we did with Project Reform on the application was we did a great deal of storytelling, but one of the rules that we had was no PowerPoint. And so when, if I would say what's a simple action someone could take is close out the PowerPoint, which causes you to ask the question, how might we engage and communicate with stakeholders so they're in on it and up on it and they're not down on it? And that came for us to be an immersive walkthrough experience that, we literally occupy. It's next door. It's 5,000 square feet of storytelling. It's 100-foot hand-drawn journey map on the floor that we took the state leaders through the very first time that they came down, of what happens to that application when it gets turned in. And it's the journey of residents and frontline workers wrestling with that system. And there was just no way to get to the end of that and say, well, this is a good thing. The gentleman, Terry Buer, who had headed up for field operations for the state of Michigan, oversaw 5,000 staff that served 2.5 million residents. He got to the end of that journey map and he just said, I've been in this department for 30 years and I've just never seen it that way. And it's one of the things I never saw as a leader until we got to Civilla was I always did storytelling for 40 years. But there's a big difference between telling a story and narrating a story.
Oh.
And narration comes from having spent deep time with those that you're trying to serve. And our job then as a leader is to steward that narrative, that story, in a way that leaders can receive it, not having feel like they're getting poked in the eye. You know, like we weren't taking people through and say, look, all the bad things that you're doing. We were taking folks through to say, this is a shared purpose. And we want to find ways to get you closer to why your own charter even began at the very, very beginning. And so that immersive storytelling and engagement help recognize the complexity, but because of storytelling, you do need to simplify it. And that helps stakeholders come along in it and ultimately understand that they're in on it and up on it, and they weren't going to be down on it.
Love that.
I love
Mike,
that.
you've navigated friction for about 40 years and you've come from a huge place like United Way. When it comes to friction and feeling stuck, what do you wish that you saw earlier in your career as a leader that you can better see now, that now fighting friction or promoting good friction is a part of like your daily practice in Civilla?
Yeah, good question. I'd say maybe just three things for me. There's so much pressure on leaders to address the needs of the institution, of the policy, of the money, of the grant, of the technology, of the business process, that it gets us too far from the end user. And I would say for me as a leader, I was always trying to do my very, very best in service to it. But I can now see that I wasn't close enough to the end user. And I wasn't really truly saying that they carry deep subject matter expertise, and that needs to be understood and honored and respected as a vital input equal to any other input. And so getting closer to the end user would be one. I would say the second is, what I can see better now is I probably went too wide, too fast, too often. Went towards the complexity instead of just really understanding the journey and say, how do we start small? And what, out of all the things that we could possibly start with, what is maybe a key domino? And never in 30 years of trying to improve access to benefits did I ever think I should start with the paper application to file. I just didn't, and that's my, error. But that's where we started at Civilla. And come to find out that that ended up being a key domino. And it's actually an essential, starting small ended up being a gateway to the larger system, And then the third thing, which I mentioned earlier, people tease me on this, but I ditch PowerPoint. And I just put the constraint on yourself of like, I got to find a way to tell this story and I can't use PowerPoint. And
That's
just see what comes of that.
That's interesting. Some of you in the audience may know that Amazon is famous for not having PowerPoint in meetings, and they force people to write before they get to meetings, and they begin by reading. And now Microsoft, which of course that's their product, PowerPoint. They've hired a bunch of Amazon executives who are banning PowerPoints at meetings. so it's kind of interesting. So Elena, can I answer Anya's question? I really like Anya's question.
Yes.
So Anya asks, who do you think should be a friction fixer in enterprise? Our reaction it is to that question, and it's in our book, it is that all of us, I mean, everybody from a frontline employee at McDonald's to a CEO, we call it the cone of friction. We have the opportunity to make things harder or easier for people. And my favorite example, I'm obsessed with this example, maybe a little bit too much, is the Department of Motor Vehicles in the state of California. And I have never filled out the benefits form that the Civilla team worked on, but I've been going to the Department of Motor Vehicles since I was 15 years old, and I'm 70 in the state of California. And it was a terrible experience until 3 years ago. I went to the Department of Motor Vehicles, and this answers your question: who can be a friction fixer? And there were 60 people in line in front of me. And I thought I was going to be there for 3 hours to do something for my late mother's car. And this gentleman who I found out was a greeter, he walked down the line and asked each of us why we're there. This is about 7:40 in the morning. And some people he told that you can't get a passport at the DMV. So those people, they're just wasting their time. But most of us, he gave a form to fill out for what we were going to do so we could do what we were doing in line, and a pen too. And then he told us what windows to go to. And I was out of there in 15 minutes, and I was completely confused that I had a great experience. So that part's in the book. But subsequently, next week, we're starting a case study of the Department of Motor Vehicles in the state of California. And there's a guy named Steve Gordon, who is the head of the Department of Motor Vehicles. And this is being close to users. They've done journey mapping of what it's like to do all sorts of different transactions with the DMV. Steve Gordon has visited all 180 field offices in the state of California and asked the employees what to fix. I mean, and there's something objective. There's something for those of us in the United States, not in Barcelona. There's every American in a couple of years is going to be required to have something called a real ID, which is an improved ID, which requires a wet signature, which means you have to sign it in front of a human being at the Department of Motor Vehicles. And by using technology and journey mapping and stuff, they have cut that from being something that takes about a half an hour at the DMV to about 8 minutes. And that, to me, that's friction fix. That's sort of like the kind of stuff you would do. So the reason I like the DMV story is everybody from that frontline greeter in Redwood City, California, who marched down the line, to Steve Gordon, who's the CEO, they're all doing things in their cone of friction to make things better for residents of the state of California like me. So I love that example.
And Bob, expand a bit on what's a cone of friction?
Well, to me, the cone of friction is just by the way, Perry Claybon, who taught the class that you had from us, he came up with the phrase cone of friction. So I'm stealing that from our friend Perry, who's a wonderful designer, as we both know. The cone of friction is just the people and processes that are within your power to influence or making things harder or easier. So as I gently explained to a Stanford administrator, when you send an email to those 2,000 people, that's your cone of friction, and you're asking each one of them to read 1,266 words for starters. And maybe you could have them read 500 and you'd save them some time, do a little editing. But that to me, that's just the people within your zone of influence, I guess, would be another way to put it. And we all can influence others. Some of us a few, some of us a lot.
And Bob, what do you think prevents a friction fixer from taking the first step? If everyone is able, why aren't there fixes all over?
Well, I mean, you know more about this than I do in lots of ways, but first of all, there's fear that if I do it, I'm going to be punished. And so, we know this, when people don't have psychological safety, there's indifference. Some people don't care. And then there's this thing which I think Huggy and I especially focus on, that very often friction is what we would call an orphan problem. It's something that you tend to blame other people for not doing something, and you don't do what you can do within your zone of influence. And I'll give you a specific example. So I was doing I'm doing talks. And I was using PowerPoint. So please forgive me, Michael. So I was talking to, there's about 300 vice presidents at a large Silicon Valley software firm. Let's do that. I'll almost protect her. So we have them do a survey, and we do this thing called the subtraction game. What's the thing that drives you craziest? What drove them craziest was Slack. So they use Slack in the organization. Slack messages that were too long, irrelevant, and too frequent. So that was the number one complaint. And then my host says, they're all vice presidents. There's hundreds of vice presidents. Who is sending the Slack messages that are too long and too complicated? And I didn't say it. She said it. Maybe you should look in the mirror. Maybe we should start there. And I just love that idea of, instead of having an orphan problem where you blame everybody, if each one of those vice presidents started maybe they just went back and looked at the last 50 Slack messages that they sent to come up with a decision rule to send them, less often and to make them shorter. So I thought that was sort of a cool example that shows that it starts by looking in the mirror.
Yeah, I think what I hear you saying is, if I want to be a friction fixer, one of the first things I can just ask is, what is in my sphere of influence? Like, what is in there? And then where might I begin? Right.
Yeah, well, I think we're talking a lot about psychological safety implicitly here, and some people, I'm very much aware of this, and I've been in this situation myself, that you have a boss or you're in a situation where it actually isn't safe to complain, and but for people who are in leadership positions, to the extent that you can make it safe for people to point things out, I think it's good. And so Amy Edmondson, who's sort of like the godmother of psychological safety, she's done some great stuff on, like, well, who are the people you want in your organization? And she said sort of noisy error makers, and people are always pointing out mistakes and things that you need to fix. And people like that can be annoying, but they also can be very helpful. And for leaders, finding people who like complain a lot, sometimes they're helpful. And I hate to bring my wife into this, but I think I will. So my wife was CEO of the Girl Scouts of Northern California for 15 years. And one of the things that she would do, and she did this 2 or 3 times, is that in every office I've ever been in, and maybe sometimes it's me, there's that person who complains and gossips a lot. And as I said, I think it might even be me sometimes. And Marina, her theory about people like that is that you want to become friends with them and talk to them a lot. And I remember one point, one of the noisy complainer types, she moved that person closer to her office and would talk to her more. And there were 2 reasons. One was she got the information about what was wrong. And the other thing, which is a little bit more instrumental, is, well, if you're friends with them, you can influence the gossip, so it helps you. So and my natural tendency is to run from people like that, but I think that's good leadership.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I'd say I've always been a big believer that the informal system in an organization is more powerful than the formal system.
Yeah.
And paying close attention to that matters. Elena, I know we got some other questions.
Yeah, Bob, we have another question that says, I'm curious if you have any examples of friction fixing within the private sector that public agencies and service providers could learn from.
Oh gosh, well, I think the learning certainly goes both ways, and I've been joking that Google needs to study the Department of Motor Vehicles, because Google's is actually doing much worse than the Department of Motor Vehicles. But for the private sector, well, let's just take one example. So meetings, sort of like meeting hygiene or whatever you want to call it. One of the things that we did, and we could apply this in academia too, in terms of working with a company called Asana. There's a woman there named Rebecca Hines who actually started as our research assistant on this book, and now she's an executive. So she worked for us for years. I actually now work for her at the Asana Work Innovation Lab. And one of the things that Rebecca and I did together, and she did most of the work, was with 60 Asana employees. We had them go through and to evaluate every standing meeting in terms of how important it was and how much work it was to do and prepare for. And actually for 30 of them, of the 60, they actually removed all standing meetings and then put them back in. So that was a little bit more of a subtraction game to get them going. And then Rebecca in particular helped them for the meetings, and there was about 20% of the meetings that were both difficult and were low and weren't important. Well, what can you do? Can you make them shorter? Can you make them less frequent? Can you make them smaller, or can you sort of cancel them and just get rid of them completely? And in the end, it looks like about the average person in this little intervention, there's 60 people, it saved almost 5 hours a month. So I thought that's something that anybody could do anywhere, and to do a little bit of meeting hygiene. And I think we all, and meetings are important, but they maybe some of them or some meetings are important, but maybe they could be shorter, they could have fewer people and so forth. So that, I think that's an example of something that could be used in any setting.
Awesome. We have 2 more questions from Anya. I'm going to first ask your most recent question, and then she has a question about AI, which will be very interesting to get your perspectives. But either of you to answer, what is the breaking point? What can be a breaking point for leaders to start fixing bad friction? So how do you maneuver from dealing with it to actually wanting to fix it?
I want Michael to answer that, since I just talk about it. You do it.
Oh, you start, and then I'll follow on.
Well, to me, the breaking point, I mean, I'm a pretty emotional person. To me, it's almost like when people just are really frustrated, when they're crying, when they give up. I mean, I do think, and I think that the folks at Civilla and those of at the Stanford D School, that we kind of start with human emotion where there's design. And I think in my whole career as an organizational theorist, when people are upset, ooh, I don't like they're upset, but maybe we can learn about this, and maybe we can solve it. And I think that's sort of the breaking point is when it's just a mess and people are upset. That's where I would start.
And to add to that, Alex asked, when do you know the juice is worth the squeeze? So what symptoms or data do you look at? And Mike, maybe you have more insight about that.
Ooh, I like that.
And on the breaking point, I can give a story where the gentleman that was over all 2,500 employees in the state of Michigan, one of the exercises that we had everyone do that came down from the state is to sit down and actually start filling out the 42-page application. And for many, it was the first time that they had ever done it. I don't say that critically. I mean, they have people that are running these programs, but it gave them new context. And the head of field operations he said on the drive home, that was the most humbling thing that he had experienced. And he got to his office and he opened up a drawer, and there were 5 full-on efforts over 30 years to change that form.
Wow.
Had never got across the finish line. And he shut that door, and that, I would say, was his breaking point. But what was interesting, his mantra, because you don't make it without courageous leaders in this. And in this case, this was Terry Buer and a whole other group at the state of Michigan. But his mantra that everyone knew was, hell or high water, we're going to get this across the finish line. And we're going to get this across the finish line with having those that we serve have their fingerprints on it. So, I told him on his tombstone, I'm putting hell or high water, and he's going to be in heaven for sure. And then the follow-on question, Elena, remind me.
It was, how do you know when it's worth it, basically? Like, what symptoms or data do you look at? So you were able to provide an example that brought him to his breaking point, but when did you decide hey, this is worth even pursuing?
Yeah, there's definitely risk that a leader, there's no way you go about this and not encounter risk, but I think it's important to try and keep it of a size that you de-risk as you go along through iterations. So you grow your confidence. So if, within the state, it was not, let's go take something statewide. It was, let's spend 3 months in an office and just see if this even works. and let's grow some data and some proof points and understanding, and let's change it and evolve it. And that way they're not affecting 2.5 million. They might be impacting 15 residents at that time. And it'd be much easier to get that course corrected. And so this starting small and work your way up to de-risk, I think for these public serving leaders is quite important. I think that would be true in any institution.
Yes.
But what ends up happening is there's so much pressure to go too wide, too fast, too big. Like we just got to throw the whole switch. And instead of just saying, actually, if we take a bit more time to do this well and iterate our way forward, we're going to save more money in the long run. And it actually will take less time, ultimately, because we won't keep going back and fixing what we could have learned much, much earlier.
So I want to follow on. So Mike, Hugging and I in this book, Scaling Up Excellence, one of the things that we talk about, and I'll use the censored version of this, is scaling cluster fugs. And and there's a whole story about whether or not we should swear in the book or not. But anyhow, so we'll call it cluster fugs for now. And when we would see that happen, an example would be IT rollouts.
Yes.
When the IT department rolls something out and it's not ready, and this has happened to Hershey's, this has happened to my university, Stanford. It's actually for my friends whose kids are applying to college right now. There's terrible problems with the system. It's all messed up. But anyhow, so we talk about this idea of this combination of illusion, it's going to be easy, impatience, and incompetence, and especially where your incompetence renders others incompetent. That's what happened with some IT rollout at Stanford. And there really is sometimes this impatience. And at least everything I've ever seen, and we'll move to AI since somebody asked about AI, everybody I've ever seen who talks about technology rollout talks about it actually takes much longer than you ever imagine. And even with OpenAI, which brings us Chat GPT, Microsoft owns them, and or owns 49% of them actually. And if you look at what's happening at the folks at Microsoft, the CTO, his whole thing is, we are going to take this slower, both because we want to get the technology right, and because it's going to take a long time for people to learn it, because it changes the way that we work. And he's trying to avoid a clusterfuck with OpenAI and ChatGPT. So to me, that's the sort of challenge of the moment, is not to just throw it at everybody and view it as an instant solution. And for those of us who are doing things like calling companies that have replaced human beings with a chatbot, and the chatbot is useless, that's an example of some of the impatience. Oh, and also I wanted to answer Anya's question, or whoever asked about another thing about OpenAI. Can this help friction or make it worse? I think the answer is, it's just like dealing with humans. If you just mindlessly use it to add more and more rules, more and more texts, and if you put stuff in ChatGPT, it's amazing how long-winded things can come out sometimes. It uses a lot of adverbs and adjectives for some reasons. I don't know why. Maybe that's because that's how humans talk. But there is a great example, and this was in the New England Journal of Medicine just recently, in the state of Rhode Island, the largest healthcare provider. They put their surgical consent form through ChatGPT and asked them to make it shorter and simpler. It was a 14-word prompt. And they cut the reading level from about 12th grade to 7th grade. The average American reads at the 6th grade level, so this is an important thing to do. And they cut it down drastically. And now 35,000 people a year who complete the surgical consent form now have a simpler form. So in some ways, ChatGPT is a little bit like humans, or a lot like humans. Is if you instruct it to simplify and make things shorter, it will do that. But if you just use it to add more stuff, it'll enable you to add more and more stuff. And the problem with it is it's equally efficient at both things. at adding complexity and subtracting complexity. So we've got to ask it to subtract complexity, at least based on this research. So I'm cautiously optimistic. Even the Chat GPT and other large language models might be able to help us simplify things if we remember to ask it to do it. So that's my little that's I think 125% of what I know about AI. And I'm in engineering school, so I'm constantly asking. I'm surrounded with people who study the social implications of AI, but that's one of the things I learned from them.
That's awesome.
In your book, Bob, you talk a lot about addition sickness.
Yes.
You know that there's this thing, and we saw that with the application, right? It's 30 years of adding because of lawsuits in different departments, and that, or we saw it with our DMV here, where over years it ended up being 16 inserts for a simple renewal, and
Wow.
working to get it down to just one page. But you mentioned in your book about a good riddance review as a really good just tool that someone could think about. Maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Well, to us, a good riddance review, or some people call call this a sludge audit too. This is Cass Sunstein, who has written so many books. It's unbelievable. He wrote a book on sludge. It's just going through, and you actually were just describing what would be a sludge audit to me. Is you're looking at a form that gets longer and longer, and what could you do to get rid of it? So there are different ways to do it, and I just described this with the meetings that Rebecca Hines had the 60 people assess. That to me, that's a good riddance review. Another example, which is one of my favorite ones, is another healthcare one, is that in the state of Hawaii, Hawaii Pacific Healthcare is the largest system in the state of Hawaii. And a woman named Melinda Ashton, what she did was, for the electronic health records, which are the bane of the existence in healthcare everywhere, they drive everybody nuts. She had doctors and nurses and nurse assistants go through, and she called it the Get Rid of Stupid Stuff campaign, and had them suggest things that they could remove from the electronic health records. They came up with 188 suggestions, and they implemented 87 of them. Then they were all subtraction. A little one I remember, and this is a classic thing you were talking about, where people just add more and more stuff over time and nobody subtracts, is they started out with 0 clicks. Because if you have a neonatal care system, where babies are born and everything, that you got a lot of diapers to change, right? I mean, that's what people are doing all day. They're changing diapers. It started out with 0 clicks, and it grew to 3 clicks. So you actually had to do 3 different clicks, go back 3 different times, and they cut that to 1. And just think about how many diapers are changed in a large system like that. That's an example to me of a good riddance review, and then they actually implemented some subtraction. But as Cass Sunstein talks about, it's got to be very context specific to figure out where you work, what's driving you crazy. And I talked about the example of the excessive Slack messages at the large organization. Some organizations don't even use Slack, so it depends of the context that you're in.
So good. We have a couple questions, and I know we're getting close to time, and so I wanted to see if we could maybe answer like 2 to 3 more. One question is, what are the right conditions or environment does a company need to reduce friction? So earlier you mentioned an example of psychological safety. Are there any other examples?
What do you think, Michael?
Well, I think it's important I think this is a leadership question. And I think it's important that leaders make sure that they're creating an environment and they understand when to take on the risk. I'll give you an example. We had really key trying to get this application along for federal approval. And we're in key meetings with policy leads who are there to protect the organization and often say no. And I'll never forget a leader, because there's risk, and there's literally like, I'm concerned, then I'm going to cause the organization to get sued, or I'll get in trouble because of that. And I'll never forget this leader, Amy Hunley was her name, brilliant leader. And she said, look, this is the right thing to do. I'll take on the risk. If it goes south, it's going to come on my desk. I'm accountable on this. So I'm asking you to help take the step and know that I'll absorb the hit. And that happened 3 different times over several months. And that was one of the essential reasons why that got through.
So good. Let's do another question really quickly. So I'm going to try to combine these two. So if either one of you want to jump in. But the question is, can you give us a few examples for how to use storytelling to communicate the value of institutional improvements to stakeholders in a way that allows the idea of system improvements to spread? And then a follow-up question to that would be, sometimes when you're suggesting these improvements or tackling friction, are there instances where that may cause friction for someone else? And how do you
That's
navigate
good.
the friction that it may cause for someone else?
Bob, you want to maybe take that?
Well, maybe you can take the first one. I want to take the second one because one of the challenges is that there are some times when you can have win-wins, shorter emails, shorter meetings where everybody sort of wins. But sometimes what you're doing when you're reducing friction is you're just handing it off to somebody else. And you really have to be careful of that. And in particular, there's an interesting actually literature on robotic bureaucracy. And what robotic bureaucracy is, there are things, we all have this who are in large organizations, things that used to be done by people or administrators, and now they hand it off to us. It's those little 10-minute forms that we have to fill out. I just had this yesterday. Somebody wanted me to just decline the request to go to a meeting, and she tried to send me to a Google Doc to fill out. And I said, "Can't I just send you an email that says no?" She said, "No, you have to go to the Google Doc to fill it out, just to decline going to a meeting." And to me, and that made her job easier, and that made the students and faculty who were going to the meetings jobs harder. And so this idea of passing along your friction to other people, that's one thing that you have to be careful of, while creating the wrong incentive for organizations. And just, I don't mean to bash administrators. I love helpful administrators, but you've got to be careful when you use things like software to put more and more load on people who are frontline employees or customers. So that's what I sort of think of.
And one thing I would just say on the storytelling question, as it relates to stakeholders, there's nothing more powerful than immersing those that care about, you have a shared purpose with stakeholders, but moving stakeholders much closer to an immersive experience of what an individual is going through. So, at times we'll bring along stakeholders when we're doing deep interviews around what someone is trying to navigate as a resident with the public benefit system, and they can come away with some very different, perspectives. As I described earlier, having someone fill out the 42-page application is very different than just saying it's a 42-page application and it's complicated. It's very different to put just a flow chart up on a screen versus walking someone and narrating that user story over 100 feet long of what happens to that. So the closer you can get stakeholders to the lived experience, and the more you're in a stance of narration of that, I think you'll make much, much greater headway. I know we need to wrap, but I have one question for you, Bob. And
I'm ready.
One last on my list here. You put a thought at the end of your book: friction fixing is fueled by civility, caring, and love.
Yep. Well, I
don't know many business books that have the word love in it.
well,
Right?
so
Just saying, talk to me about Why love?
About love. Well, so where this is stolen, I'll go straight to the love since we're running out of time. There's a guy named Todd Park. Todd Park had severe capitalists. He and his brother Ed started a software company, healthcare software company. They sold for a fortune, called Athena Health. So that's one. He was a real capitalist. Then he was the CTO of the White House. He fixed the Obamacare form. He led that. Used to take like you click and it take 8 seconds, and now he and Ed have something called Devoted Health, which is for Americans like me over 65 years old, to help us have a better healthcare experience because it's so fragmented and so difficult. And his philosophy is, I couldn't believe it. He talked about love for 5 minutes, which is that if we start and he's really good at logistics, he's a really good software person. If we start with the notion that every one of our patients or customers, we want to think of them as our mother or father using the system. What experience would we want for someone we love? And then we go backwards and think about what we want for them logistically.
Mhm.
And I thought that was just like an inspired thing. And Devoted Health, I think they're in 16 or 17 states. And so I'd love to hear from customers whether they're actually getting to that. But I really liked that as a design philosophy. If you start out with love, like what would you want for someone that you love? So so I'm stealing this from Todd Park, who's like one of the most exciting executives I ever met. And he's done some friction fixing. He's really, I mean, the reason the Obamacare site works is because he got the lifelong bureaucrats and the Silicon Valley hotshots to work together. And so Marina worked with him. Marina Nitze, who's also worked with you.
Yeah.
She worked with Todd Park in Washington.
Wow. Well,
Elena,
this
take
was
us out.
so great. Before we close, I want to lead us into a practice that Civilla does when we end the day. So when we end the day, we all go around and we share one word that really describes maybe a thought, maybe a process, maybe something that we were really motivated by. And so as you exit the chat, I would love for you all to drop one word. And thank you all just so much for contributing and asking questions. We definitely want to stay in touch with you and provide you more events like this. So Mike, I would love for you to kick us off with your one word. Bob, you'll follow, and then everyone can add in the chat.
Mine is gratitude.
I like the love one.
Mine is definitely motivated. Everyone's gratitude, love, validation, assist.
Opening day in Detroit. All right. I used to go to
Tigers.
Opening day.
Let's go Tigers.
An old Tiger Stadium.
Gratitude.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Yes.
Thank you. And Bob, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you all so much. We'll be in
It was so
touch with
fun.
everyone. Thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Adam's here. Nice to see Adam.